This Tuesday, I got an email from a friend of mine from my old parish in St. Anne in Bristol, Virginia. This friend, Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, is a very interesting woman. She was not only a parishioner, but I really got to know her and her husband, who became dear friends while I was there. She was somebody, she show jumps and does dressage with horses. She raises sheep, shears them, and then she makes her own thread, and then she weaves her own loom and makes things on a loom. And more importantly, her main job is she's a fairly famous children's author. And the email that I got on Tuesday was to tell me that she had won a Newbery Award for her new book, The War That Saved My Life, which is about a teenage girl who her mother, because of her deformity of her foot, never let her get out of her apartment in London, and that the Blitz actually allowed her to escape from her apartment and learn how to do things in life. But the reason I mention her today is she allowed me to help her with one of her novels called A Leap of Faith. She invited me into the process of storytelling. And you know, everyone loves storytelling, right? We're going to be we're entering into a 4-week homily series about how to tell the story of our lives. And so one of the ways is kind of reflect on everyone loves stories. How do we enter into it? Well, she allowed me in this book, Leap of Faith, which was about a girl who didn't believe in God, and through her time in a Catholic school, she actually entered into through the RCIA. And when Kimberly does a story the first time through, she does a very first draft, which is very fast, and it's awful. It's just the dialogue's wooden, the plotting stuff, it just doesn't work. But what she does is she spends time with the story, and then she also gets feedback from her editor, from people like me, from her subjects, and she keeps working on the story and working on the story to understand it at a deeper and deeper level, and she becomes this marvelous storyteller. It's the same thing with the faith. We're all invited to tell a story, the story of our lives in conjunction with God's life. So we have two options when we tell the story of our life. Either our life is part of a larger story, an epic, or it's a very small story because it's only our story. 2 weeks ago, when we were celebrating the Feast of the Epiphany, we were with, in the gospel, those two choices. The wise men, the magi, the three kings were invited to, in their story, join it with God's story of salvation, not just for the people of Israel, but for all the nations of the world. They were led to follow that star because God was inviting them to a deep, deep understanding that their life was involved in a story beyond themselves. But yet, in that same Sunday, we had an example of somebody who thought the story was all about him, Herod. It was all about him and power. So every single one of us is faced with a choice. When we want to tell the story of our lives, do we see ourselves as part of God's larger story, and therefore our life has the capacity to be part of an epic understanding of our life in this world, or do we see it as just the story about us? We're just going to concentrate about ourselves. That choice has incredibly different results depending on what choice that we make. The second week, last week, we had another thing that we have to keep in mind when we want to tell the story of our life. Not just whether we're part of this larger story or whether we're part of a small story, but realize that God is already our co-author. In the baptism of the Lord, Jesus was recognizing his mission, his vocation to save us. He was accepting the Father's plan for him. We have to look, when we look at the story of our lives, the fact is that a lot of the story has already been written. It's written in our DNA. It was written where we were born, what faith we were born into. Even if we were born outside that faith or born outside this country, our situation often guides our choices of where we have been brought to this point. So God is the co-author. So much of we can't decide our family. We can't decide our language. It's already pretty much set for us when we're born. Well, God has a purpose for each one of us too. And if we want to understand the story of our life, we have to understand, what is your purpose for me? In the gospel today, we have a third thing that we have to understand in terms of understanding the story of our life. If we're going to go deeper and reflect on it, to understand that our life is bigger than ourselves, we can't do it in isolation. Some people think their story of their life is pretty boring. Nothing much happens to me. Well, when we share how God is acting in our life with other people, all of a sudden people can help us understand how we're part of this epic understanding of how God acts in the world. And we have to do it with other people. In the gospel today, we have a situation. Okay, we have a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and Jesus and his disciples and Mary are there, and the couple has a problem. They've run out of wine. Okay, that may not seem like much of a problem to us. He says, well, why didn't we send them down to the wine cellar? Why didn't we send them to Martin's or Farm Fresh? No, they don't exist at that point. But also, we don't understand why it's such a big deal. The guests would understand if you didn't have that wine. No. The problem is, by running out of wine, they were failing in their duty of hospitality. And this couple would have been marked literally for the rest of their lives of having failed this duty of hospitality at their wedding feast. There goes that couple that invited us to their wedding, but they ran out of wine. So somebody, you don't tell all of your problems to everyone, right? We come to Mass, and I know that there are folks, I'm looking out here, and I already know many of your stories. I know many of your issues, but you all don't stand on the pews and say, I'm having this problem in my life, or I'm having this problem in my life. No, we have our church face on, right? But you need somebody to know your story, to pray for them, so that they don't feel like they're alone. So somebody had told Mary their story, the thing that was bothering this couple. And what does she do? She immediately brings it to Jesus. They have no wine. Now, we get this response from Jesus where he seems like he's putting his mother off. What is this concern of your concern to me? My hour has not yet come. See, Jesus knows that once he does this first sign of his ministry, the story of his life, which he knows is going to lead to the cross and to resurrection, is going to begin in that moment. The story for which he came was going to begin. He had lived a hidden life up until this moment, but as soon as he did this act, this miracle, it was going to come swift and fast. I would hesitate if I knew that one action was going to change everything. But what does Mary do? She listens to him and helps him to fulfill his story by saying, do whatever he tells you to do. And when Jesus is and that's something to remember, that the Blessed Mother is there not just to give life to our Messiah, but she's actually there to help initiate the story of our salvation by inviting him to do this first of his signs. But when Jesus does this sign, what happens? This bride and groom must be over the moon, because where they had run out of wine, all of a sudden they had this superabundance of wine, right? And when we understand what God is doing in our life, God doesn't give in small ways. He gives us a superabundance of grace. None of us have a small story to share. All of us have been gifted by the Spirit. That's our second reading today. All of us have been uniquely gifted by the Spirit for the sake of the body of the church. And so we need to find a way to share faith with others. This parish has been trying to create opportunities for small group faith sharing. And we have about 600 of our parishioners who are involved in some ways in small faith sharing groups. We have about 8,000 parishioners, however. So there is a large harvest still yet to encourage folks. If you want to become a storyteller, if you want to understand on how to tell the story of how God is acting in your life, and know that your storytelling is important, because only you have this unique story that God has given you to tell. And you might say, I don't know how to put it in words. Well, that's what this homily series is going to be about, helping us to do that. That's what the invitation to small groups are going to be about, helping us to work at it and spend time on this story. The story of our salvation, the story of Christ coming into the world, and how we have a role in making him known. And when God allows that to be seen, people come to believe in Jesus Christ. Just as that wedding feast of Cana, that simple, small sign, which they thought was just about a wedding, was really about Jesus becoming the bridegroom. They were caught up in a story they couldn't even imagine. So as we come to this liturgy and hear the story of our faith, spend time with it. Learn and ask, how does my story fit into this? And then help and share with one another that story for the sake of the Spirit, the gift that the Spirit God has given each one of us.